Hello and welcome to the first of the themes lessons. Today we are going to be looking at peace and conflict. So this is for the paper 2. So for many exam boards you'll have two different papers, one for all the religious stuff and then one for all the themes, the topics that occur in day-to-day life that we're looking through a religious lens on. So today we are looking at peace and conflict, and the first thing we need to look at really are the reasons behind why conflict starts in the first place. Now, the first reason will be because of the resources. So in countries where you are rich in materials or minerals, whatever it might be, if there's something that is seen as valuable by another country, that could be a reason as to why people want to go to war in the first place. So if it means they can gain something, that can be a really important factor. As well as then self-defense. In a situation where you are being attacked, you might feel the need to defend yourself, and that can contribute to a war. So when we look at the conflict in Ukraine, for example, the Ukrainians fighting back is a form of self-defense. So the reason the war has continued so long is because of that self-defense. And then finally, we have retaliation. So someone has done something and you are acting back, usually in the same way that they have done something to you. So in situations where one country has done something, let's say, for example, the USA decided to attack Iraq, for example, after a while, this could then end up being then Iraq decided to attack back, and it goes vice versa. The problem with these sorts of wars, though, is that they never really have an ending point. It just goes sort of one point for the other. As soon as one person does something, the other person's going to do something. As soon as one country does something, the other country is going to do something. The problem is, though, that some of these reasons aren't exactly valid. As we saw with the retaliation one, it's not going to be a justifiable war. It's not going to be something that's going to have a good end result. So different religious groups have different ideas behind what they see as a justifiable reason for war. The first of those being resources, they don't think that's a justifiable reason. So in a situation where you are only looking to gain rather than anything else, you're instantly putting yourself into a position where you're being very greedy and you're not considering the needs or the wants or desires of other people. And that goes against a lot of religious teaching. So for many religious groups, they're not going to see a war based on resources as being one that is justifiable. However, self-defense, yeah, they're going to be okay with that. They're going to agree with the use of self-defense as long as it is with the aim of causing no more harm than is needed. If you can defend yourself without causing unnecessary harm, then you should try to do so. Obviously, the best case scenario here is you try and solve things peacefully, but we'll talk about that a little later on. And then finally, retaliation. Now, for the most part, religious organisations will see this as wrong. However, there are moments where wars have been fought based on retaliation within religious groups. When we look at the Crusades, for example, a war between the Christians and the Muslims, a holy war, a lot of that was retaliation. A lot of that was also partially resources, looking for land, the reclaiming of the Holy Land of Jerusalem, as well as Constantinople. These places are things that Christians and Muslims fought a lot over. However, a big part of that was that retaliation. Christians wanted to take back Jerusalem first. Muslims came back and reclaimed it. Christians went back, Muslims went back. And it just went back and forth 9 times in total. So there were lots of different wars that occurred that were all based on retaliation, hence why some religious groups are going to say this is okay. Next, we have this idea of the just war theory. This is the idea that a war should have a justifiable cause, so the reasoning behind the war should be justifiable. It has to be a last resort, so they have to have tried every peaceful option first. It can't just be they've gone straight in and started fighting. They have to have tried peace talks before any sort of war started. You have to go in with good intention. You can't just start a war because you feel like it. It has to be with good intention of protecting other people rather than causing unnecessary harm. Next, you have this idea of proportionality. Now, proportionality literally just means that the force that is used against you, you use. This stops you then going above and beyond using excess force, which would be really problematic. It means you are intending to cause more harm than has been caused to you. So for Christians especially who use the just war theory, proportionality is a really important factor in that. You have to also go through a correct authority, so you need to speak to someone in charge first before you just go and start a war. This isn't something that you will just sit back and go and do. You have to have conversations first. Plans need to be put in place. It needs to actually be agreed upon by the correct authority. So in the UK, for example, any war that is started has to go through the king. This isn't something that the parliament gets to decide or people get to decide. Any official war that isn't going to break war crimes, they have to go through that correct authority. And finally, they need to have some level of chance of success. If a war is clear that you're never going to win, there's no way that you can justify it. There has to be that chance of success. Now, a really easy way to remember this is clippers. Okay, so a really easy way is clippers. So I don't know if you want to make a note of that anagram there. I will give you a moment to copy those down. In 3, 2, and 1. But obviously, we need to link this back then to some sort of religious teaching, because it's all well and good understanding this is what religious people believe, but we need to know why it is they believe that. When we look at the story of David and Goliath, David was a young boy who decided he would take on this giant who had threatened his people. The Philistines versus the Israelites, with Goliath being a Philistine. Goliath threatened he would kill every single person unless somebody would challenge him face to face. So David, a 14-year-old boy at the time, decided that he would take his sort of shepherd's slingshot, which isn't exactly like it is on the screen here, it's just a visual representation. He would take that and he would go and fight this man. Now, most people would say, well, where's the chance of success here? Well, the chance of success was that David had God on his side. For many Christians, they look at the story of David, and actually from his childhood, he was a shepherd who had to fight off wolves, lions, bears. So he was someone who was used to fighting things in a much bigger frame than him. So obviously when we see David step forward to Goliath and he says this, that you come against me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. So this is taken from the book of Samuel in the Bible, and it shows that David was clearly willing to fight. Now, does it meet the just war theory? Yes, it does. There was a justifiable cause. People were being threatened and they needed to defend themselves. Was this a last resort? Yes. It took 40 days for David to actually step forward and fight Goliath. They tried every other option first and they failed. Was there a good intention? Yes, again. They were there focusing on saving the Israelites rather than causing unnecessary harm to the Philistines. Was it proportional? I would argue this was more than proportional, if actually not proportional at all, on the basis that David had significantly less than Goliath did. So the fight wasn't exactly fair, but they weren't using excessive force, victors that being. Was the correct authority used? Yes, absolutely. King Solomon was confronted by David, and David asked him to see if he could fight Goliath, to which King Solomon agreed. And as we said, that chance of success, the fact that David knew that he had God on his side, meant that he was confident that he could defeat Goliath, which at the end of the story he does. He uses his slingshot, knocks Goliath down to the ground, and then cuts off his head, which is a little bit more gory than some of the stories you may hear at primary school, but now looking at the GCSE content, that's more of the reality of what happened in this situation. So very quickly then, let's see if we can remember what were the clippers. I'm going to stop the video here. I'm going to do a countdown from 3, and then I'm going to reveal the answers to you. So I'll let you pause the video now, have a go, see if you can remember what the just war theory was, and I'll be revealing those answers in 3, 2, and 1. So let's have a look then. It was, of course, the just cause, last resort, good intention, proportionality, correct authority, and chance of success. So that's the Christian view on war. Let's have a look then at the Islamic view. Now, the Islamic view is one of lesser jihad, which is something we have covered previously in one of the Islam lessons, on one of the Islam practices lessons, the 10 obligatory acts. Lesser jihad follows this criteria here. When it comes to war, it has to have a justifiable cause, so that agrees with the just war theory. However, this can't be the basis of conversion. So when you are fighting in a war, and let's say, for example, you were a Muslim country and you were fighting another country who wasn't Muslim, you couldn't go in and then impose your religion on those people who weren't Muslim already. You can't force them into it. It can't be for the aim of conversion. It has to be in self-defense. It cannot be a case of you being the aggressor. You have to use self-defense. Okay, so again, kind of like the last resort situation, self-defense is needed here. Now, the slight difference here is that you need a religious authority for lesser jihad. So that would be going to your political leader in an Islamic country, or going even to your imam and talking to them and saying, look, this has happened, I need a resolve to this situation, and that might allow you to use lesser jihad. Now remember, lesser jihad does not necessarily mean the use of violence, it's just the defense of your faith. So in a situation where somebody has verbally offended you, you might want to go and speak to the imam about the best response that you can give to that person, not so much to attack them, but more to educate them, help them understand why it is that you believe what it is that you do. And then finally, it can't be for any particular gain. So it can't be for financial, political gain, it can't be for the gain of resources or even really land. You're not supposed to go and invade a country just to claim it. So for example, the use of the war of Russia and Ukraine, that would not fit the lesser jihad model, because many would argue there is not a justifiable cause there. Now, granted, there's no conversion necessarily taking place in terms of religion, but they are trying to look at making Russia a bigger place, so converting those people from Ukrainian into Russians. The same again, this was not a case of self-defense from the Russian perspective. You know, they definitely invaded first, which is what caused that conflict. Religious authority, again, they're not necessarily going to use that, but this is again for gain. So we can see that there are real examples of war and conflict that either fit this model perfectly and are seen as fairly okay wars and understandable wars, whereas other wars seem a little bit more drastic and a little bit more rash in their approach. The lack of justification, the lack of sort of intention in these wars makes them not justifiable by religious believers. Now, here we see a quote from the Quran, so I'll give you a minute to copy that down. But it's clearly saying that actually permission to fight is given if you need it, you know, and even in some situations, as long as you are doing so justifiably, Allah is actually going to support you in that conflict. He will be there with you to ensure that, you know, nothing goes wrong, per se. Moving on then, we're going to look at the weapons of mass destruction. WMD. So we have nuclear weapons, we have chemical weapons, and we have biological weapons. We're going to look at two examples of nuclear weapons used, but for those who don't know what nuclear weapons are, effectively nuclear bombs that are dropped that cause mass amounts of radiation, which has lots of impacts, not primary but secondary impacts as well. Chemical weaponry is when you use chemicals as a form of weapon. So an example of this would be the use of mustard gas during the World Wars. Now, this wasn't exactly a successful use because the mustard gas was then carried by the wind, which took it back over the British trenches, meaning that actually we ended up gassing ourselves. Whereas then finally, biological weapons of mass destruction, these could be the use of viruses or diseases to cause your enemies to suffer. Now, historically, they have done all sorts of crazy forms of biological weapons of mass destruction. They've flung dead bodies in catapults over city walls to try and spread the plague, making people very, very unwell. They've used blankets that had been covered in disease to treat those who were... Now, you could argue that any viruses that could cause a mass pandemic, for example, could be weaponized. Now, although there isn't necessarily an example of this, it is a risk that people are worried about. So as a result of this, we need to question what the religious people are going to say about these things, and they're going to disagree with every single one. The biggest factor in why they disagree with the use of these weapons is the fact that they are completely indiscriminate. They do not care who they impact, they do not care who they kill. These weapons of mass destruction will wipe out a wide variety of people, including people who are completely innocent. So as a result of this, many Christians, many Muslims are going to be against the use of these types of weapons because they just can't control them. They're going to impact too many people. Also, it's completely illegal. This idea of it being a war crime to use these weapons of mass destruction, in fact, it's illegal now to even produce them as long as they have signed that treaty. Now, funnily enough, the only people who haven't signed that treaty are the countries with ownership of nuclear weapons. So now we can't necessarily make any more, but we don't need to get rid of the ones we have. However, it's going to be impossible to use them because it would be considered a war crime. The issue is that if one country uses a weapon of mass destruction against another country that has a weapon of mass destruction, all that will end up happening is a total global destruction. In fact, they believe that if a certain amount of nuclear bombs were used within the Earth's lifetime, then it would end up causing a nuclear winter where the sort of the dust and the smoke and all of that stuff would block out the sun completely, plummeting the Earth's temperatures and causing everything on it to freeze. So that would obviously be a real big, terrible thing to happen. So people aren't going to want to cause what they call a mutually assured destruction. They're not going to want to use their nuclear weapons out of concern that other people might use their nuclear weapons on them. Next, we need to then look at the examples of those two nuclear bombs, and specifically we're going to look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki from World War II. Now, during this time, over 200,000 people are estimated to have died. Now, obviously, they can't say specifically the exact number, and that's because what ended up happening in a lot of cases were people got vaporized. They just completely disintegrated. So actually finding bodies of people wasn't exactly easy. Not only this, it wasn't just the primary impacts that killed people. As I said, a lot of people faced secondary impacts, specifically from the radiation. Different cancers like leukemia started to develop in young people, as well as genetic mutations in newborns. So this was then something that was passed on through generation to generation to generation. People still being impacted by that level of radiation that they faced in the places of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, fortunately, these places are starting to return to normal radiation levels, meaning that some of them are starting to return to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it's still, had a huge impact on quite a wide variety of people. The problem here, though, is that actually, according to Christianity, there wasn't exactly all that much done wrong here. Now, a particular chaplain who's like a priest in different professions, there was a military chaplain called George Zabelka who actually blessed the people who went to go and drop those bombs, showing that he gave some element of agreement with their use. Now, in his eyes, he was told that this was in agreement with the just war theory. However, George Zabelka then later came out, about 50 years later, saying he was brainwashed. He was brainwashed into thinking that this was an acceptable thing to do, and he was extremely apologetic for ever having anything to do with the use of nuclear weaponry. So although it looked like at the time that Christianity was actually in support of using these weapons of mass destruction, later on, as time went on, they recognised that this was a major error in thought and wasn't something that they ever wanted to partake in again. So an alternative then to the use of war would be pacifism. Now, in its simplest form, it's just non-violence in all situations, where you can avoid being violent, where you don't use any form of violence to get your point across. You would find alternative ways to solve issues, such as communication and talking. Now, in the Bible, it says to love your enemies. So that means that regardless of how much you may dislike someone, you still need to treat them with love and respect. The argument, therefore, is that in Christianity, fighting each other and killing each other isn't exactly the most loving thing that you could do in those situations. So during wars, what you end up seeing are these people called conscientious objectors. They refused to fight in the war because it went against their beliefs. They were pacifists and they thought that violence was wrong, and so they refused to fight and were therefore given these titles. And in some cases, they were even given prison sentences as a form of punishment for their refusal to fight in the wars. An example, though, would be Desmond Doss. Now, he was a Christian who refused to carry any weaponry into war. This was because of his Christian belief and his pacifist beliefs. Now, during World War II, in the Battle of Hacksaw Ridge, he went out without a single gun into no man's land, saving as many people who had gone over the top of the cliffs. Now, in one night, he managed to save 75 people, including some soldiers from the enemy side, and treating them as if they were his friends. Now, this was a really incredible story of someone who genuinely wanted what was best for the world. If you have ever seen the film Hacksaw Ridge, there's a quote from the film that he says he wants to put a little bit of the world back together again when everything's just falling apart. And that's the view of many Christians then. So for many Christians, such as the Quaker group and the Ambulance of Friends Society, they went in as medics during the war to help those who were wounded and didn't have an active part in the fighting. So that's how some Christians would get around being part of the army without necessarily having to carry any weaponry at all. Now, we get on to looking at the exam technique, and this is a message specifically then to the AQA exam board. If you do want to skip past this, if you're not part of the AQA and this isn't relevant to you, then please do feel free to skip ahead to when we look at the 12 or the 15 mark question. Otherwise, stick around and make sure you're listening to this. Because the second paper in the AQA exam board is very different, because nowhere in it does it actually specify religious belief in questions. So you need to include that religious belief in your answer. So if the question came up, for example, saying explain 2 beliefs about pacifism, you would need to say 1 Christian belief or 1 Muslim belief. You would have to specify that religious view. If you don't, you will be capped at half marks. So it's crucial that you make sure that you include that religion in your answer, especially if you're doing what we've recommended of using the wording of the question as your sentence starter. Do not fall to the trap of not including the name of the religion you are including in your answer. Now, you might also see some 5-mark questions referring to contemporary British society. This means that they're looking for you to think about what the religious belief is in modern day Britain. Now, although this is mostly an atheist country now, Christianity is still is the head of the Church of England. So when you see contemporary British society, it's referring to Christianity. So your answer has to have somewhere in it reference to Christianity. In your 12-mark questions, as we'll look at in just a minute, you can use non-religious views. You need to include some religious views in your answer. However, you can dot in a few atheist views in there as well. Because with the themes, we're talking about real-world issues that anyone can have an opinion on, not just religious believers. Although understanding religious belief is important, understanding how other people think and more worldviews and what they are, that can also be really important. Now, in your answers, you can use just Christianity, you can just use Islam, or you can use multiple religions in the same answer, unless it is obviously talking about contemporary British society, in which case you need to make sure that you include Christianity in your answer. Here's an example of what a question could look like. So explain 2 ways religious beliefs in contemporary British society might justify war. So in this, you're going to focus on Christianity and you're going to focus on the just war theory. You could use the story of David and Goliath to back up your argument if you wished for that 5-mark question. Now, keep your eyes peeled for those who are Year 10 AQA students who are doing the GCSE exam next year, as there are some updates to the exam paper and the exam questions, which we're going to look at in the next lesson. So now then, we need to look at this 12-mark question. Religious believers should never use violence. Now, obviously, as we know, you need to agree and disagree with the statement before reaching your own justifiable conclusion. Here, what I've done is I've given you some key points with some quotations that you could take out of this table and you could put into full sentences and start off your own answer. So you could look at the fact that Jesus taught pacifism, so the fact that one of the messages of love your enemies is such a crucial thing for many Christians, that you should treat the people around you as if they were your friends and family. You could use the conscientious objector argument, and you could speak about the fact that Desmond Doss went into warfare never using violence once, and you could use that story as an example in your paragraph. And then finally, you could talk about the regret that George Zabelka felt about dropping that nuclear bomb. The fact that he felt brainwashed, he felt pushed into this decision and making you think that it was okay when actually it wasn't. So you could use that quote there from George Zabelka if you wished. And then on the disagree side, we can say that actually in the Old Testament of the Bible, there was lots of war, there was lots of conflict. You could use the story of David and Goliath if you wished. You could also use the example of self-defense, the fact that actually in some cases you might be the one being attacked and therefore you need to defend yourself. Now, I haven't given the full quotations here because hopefully you've copied them down yourself. But the permission to fight is given in the fact that Allah would fight alongside you, shows that actually in some cases violence might be needed. And also the fact that when you are receiving orders from people of authority, if you refuse those orders, that could cause a lot of problems for you. So even for Desmond Doss, it nearly landed him in prison. There were lots of people who did end up getting punished as a result of refusing to fight in a war. Hopefully that has given you enough then to be able to answer a 12 or 15 mark question depending on your exam board. And this has been then the first themes lesson wrapped up. Apologies that this has been a slightly shorter lesson. I hope it's been just as useful. In the next one, as I said, for those who are studying AQA, there will be the new questions, the new question types that are going to be coming out for next year's exam paper. We're going to be looking at those in a little bit more detail as well. Thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.